I mean, of course, all of you know that consciousness is one of the most difficult problems, apparently, in science. But sometimes, in order to understand a problem that seems to be impossible to deal with, we need to understand the assumption that we move from in order to deal with such a problem. So it might be, and that's my point here, that so far the problem of consciousness has been considered so difficult because we have accepted the wrong premises about it. And so today I would like to start very quickly, and maybe Tim will help me in that, to address why, what are the assumptions that neuroscience usually moves from when dealing with the topic of consciousness. And I will suggest you a completely different way to address the problem of consciousness. And that's why all of you have an apple. I gave you all of you an apple, and that's also why I brought with me a brain and an apple. So first of all, let me start to say why consciousness is a problem for us. The main reason why consciousness seems to be a very almost impossible problem in science is that consciousness seems to do something that is impossible in the physical world. Namely, consciousness seems to allow our body or our brain or whatever we are to have an experience of something else from what our body or whatever we are is. What I mean is that right now, for example, you have an apple in your hand. And I ask you to consider for a moment to consider the apple you have in your hand, not just look at me. Right now you have an object, and this is a real object that you have in front of you. And this object that you have in your hand has its own properties. Namely, it is red, it is round, it is shiny, it is probably cold right now in your hands. And you have an experience of all such properties. Now, why is this a mystery for science? Because science assumes that you're not that object. You're something else. That's not only science, that's also common sense. If you ask to the layman, are you the object that you are perceiving? Of course they say, no, I'm not. I'm not external world, I'm something else. I see the world, I perceive the world through the senses. That's a commonsensical view. This commonsensical view got glorified in the traditional view by computational neuroscience, according to which the brain receives information from the external world and somehow it interprets such information in terms of subjective experience. But all this, let's say, all this model is based on the idea that we are separate from the external world. All of this world is based on the idea that the apple is there. The apple is there in your hand, is outside your body. And you are somewhere else. Where? Well, that's a little bit unclear where you are exactly. But the general consensus is that you are somewhere inside your nervous system. Well, there are people that are, more open to that, like the embodied cognitive people, and they say, well, I'm not just inside my brain. That's the computational approach, the Cartesian approach to the brain. God forbid, we are not just a brain. We are a body that looks better. But even if you are a body, you're still different from the apple that remains as far from your body as it was from your brain. So consciousness, and now today let me start with the simplest possible case of experience. So let's forget for a moment memory, dreams, imagination and the like. Emotions, all complex stuff. Let's go to the basics, square one. I perceive an apple, and the apple is there. So there's no memory, there's no imagination, there's no hallucination here. It's just perception. And it's veridical perception, standard perception. So everything goes well. There's an apple, and I have an experience of the apple. But even in such a very simple case, it is still a mystery. Why? Because the apple is there, and I assume I am here. Here is a little bit vague, as I said. Nobody knows where here is. But still, once I assume that the apple is there and that I'm here, a mystery arises. Now, let me ask you, at this point, while it is true that the mystery arises, is it a mystery we experience, or it is a mystery that we have been taught about it? What I mean is that, do we really perceive a contrast between my experience of the apple and the apple, or actually I always perceive an apple, and it was only because people taught me that I am inside the brain, that I am different from the apple, that I started to think about my perception of the apple as a problem. So what I'm asking you is to consider whether in your own experience you ever really had any split between the physical world and your experience, if for a moment we forget dreams, hallucinations, and the like. And my guess is that if you think about your perception of the world, there is just one world. There isn't a mental world and a physical world. That's something that we've been taught about at school, reading Descartes, reading Neuroscience, which is very Cartesian in a way. They don't have the soul and the world, but they have the computational processes and the external world. And that, to me, is very Cartesian. Even if most neuroscientists, in the first page of their books, the first thing they say is, we are not Cartesians. We are against Cartesian dualism. But then they present reality as if it was made of two different domains. On one domain, the physical object. On the other domain, the models, the representations, the information that we get from those models. And although we don't call information soul or immaterial mind, it very much behaves like the Cartesian immaterial mind. So it's very difficult for me not to have the impression that neuroscience is still based on kind of dualistic framework. So let me get back to the original.
Can I ask you one thing?
Yeah, please.
You said, I have an experience of the apple.
Right.
So we have three things. I experience apple.
Right.
And we have a verb which indicates possession, usually.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, is that actually the nature of that? Do you really feel that that's how it feels with apples, that there's a possession of, like, you can't not look at it, you can't not possess it? Like you suggested in age, also that split of experience and I is problematic.
So, okay, let me get back to that.
It seems to me that language in its very attempt to talk about it starts to suggest a kind of analysis, a kind of panorama where we have these three things, but I don't know if that's actually what it feels like.
Exactly. So when we say something, I see an apple, we have three entities. I see an apple, or I have an experience of an apple, and I would say that there's only one thing that we know something about, and it's not the eye, it's not the seeing or the experience, but it's the apple. So if I say a sentence like, the apple lays on the table, everything is clear to me. The apple, the table, and laying on top of the table. But if I say something like, I see the apple, I wonder, because there are two entities which I've never seen, namely the eye and the experience of the apple. I've seen only apples. And so, let me say something more. But once we assume, when we take seriously language, which is Cartesian, I see an apple, that's very Cartesian. I see an apple. It is impossible not to be Cartesian once we accept that way of speaking. Because
basically, what you're saying is that this posits a mental existence. Like, as soon as we have the word I and experience, you've posited an area of experience which we call mental.
Exactly.
Okay, so that your apple is a mental thing. It's not the apple. Okay.
Exactly. But
so basically, language is always suggesting the existence of the mental.
Exactly.
Talk to us about the mental.
But language, not experience. We find the mental in the language, not in our experience. We find the mental in the way in which we describe our experience with the language, with the world. We don't find the mental in our experience per se. We find the mental in the way in which we describe our experience, because we assume that there's an I, and the I, language, and language presents the I as it was something different from the apple. And then we are compelled to go to look for the I, for the experience of the apple, inside the only plausible candidate, which is the body. And that makes a lot of sense. And it would make a lot of sense if we could find anything like our experience inside the brain. That's why, as of Johannes Müller, or whoever you want to pick up from the 19th century history of neurophysiology, that's why neuroscientists have been looking for the experience of the apple inside the brain. Have they been able to find anything remotely like the experience of the apple inside the brain so far? No, nothing like that. They found beautiful neural mechanism, extremely interesting, extremely important, but they haven't found anything remotely like the experience of the apple. And so, if I would say, if there's one result that all of research on consciousness has shown in neuroscience, has been that in the brain there isn't anything like the experience of the apple. So far, in all the textbooks about neuroscience, there's not a single line explaining how chemical electric activity in neurons can transform into the experience of red, round, and shiny. There's nothing that explains how can we go from neural spikes to the red. We have no idea. Zero evidence about that.
I wonder if you could formulate that again, just eliminating totally the word experience. Like you said, there's nothing in the neural activity that explains the experience of the apple. But what if you just eliminate experience and just say,
Exactly.
because exactly what is it that makes it necessary to talk about the experience of the apple rather than the world itself? I don't know.
The reason why, exactly, that's a very good point. Why do we need to talk about anything like consciousness or anything like experience? I use experience, just a caveat. I use the word experience and consciousness as they were synonyms. For me, they mean exactly the same thing. I often prefer to use the word experience because it's less loaded of philosophical connotations. But in this discussion this morning, I will use both words as synonyms. But Tim asked me, do we really need to talk about experience? And that's the key point. We needed to talk about experience because we assumed that we are separate from the external object, that we are not external object. And if we held that assumption, namely if we held that we are not the external object, we need something else to bring the external object's properties inside us. Because if you're not the apple, and we have we somehow got to the apple properties, we need somehow to take those properties inside whatever we are. And we call this thing that we bring in experience. So if you have the apple in your hand, and which means that the apple is outside your body, and you still have an experience of the apple, the only possible conclusion is that somehow you get something inside you. And how do you call this something that you get inside you? You call it experience. And then you look for this mysterious entity inside you. And for example, you look for something like your phenomenal subjective experience inside your brain. But so far, as I was saying, no one had been able to find anything like subjective experience inside the brain, inside neural activity. I know there's plenty of research about neural correlates of consciousness. I know that Tononi, for example, presented the theory of integrated information, but Tononi so far has not been able to explain how integrated information becomes phenomenal experience. It's not any easier to transform integrated information into red than to transform neural spikes into red. They are both colorless. So we haven't had any step forward. So
yeah, can I just interrupt? So what you're leading to with all this is the idea that when you look at the object, the thing that is you, at least part of that thing, is the object in that moment. Okay? Okay.
Yes.
That's kind of nutty, isn't it?
No,
Everybody knows
I
that's
haven't
stupid.
yet made that step.
Yeah, but
So
you're going to make that
I'm
step.
going to make that step.
Yeah, but it's crazy, isn't it? I
Yes,
mean,
but let me make-
that, clearly these people don't think they're the apple. I mean,
Okay,
how
but
can they possibly?
but let me make that step in my own terms, and then you
But
can.
it's kind of obvious you're going to.
Okay, but for them maybe it's not at all.
I believe you.
And you believe me, right? Okay. So my point is that, and then I will get to an end of it, that neuroscientists have been looking for consciousness or something like consciousness inside brains, and they haven't not been able to find anything like that. So the logical approach would have been to say, we've been looking for that inside the brain for 100 years, for 150 years. We haven't been able to find consciousness inside the brain, so maybe it's not there. So that for me would have been the logical step. So if we are looking for something, we have been looking, physicists have been looking for ether for 100 years in the 19th century. After a while, they've not been able to find ether anywhere, and so they said, well, maybe it's not there. Likewise, neuroscientists have been looking for consciousness inside of the brain, and they haven't been able to find anything like that. So, at least it might make sense to look elsewhere. Where?
May I play the
Yes, please do.
role of the devil advocate just to
Yeah,
get
please
the side
do.
of my colleagues? I think that there is an alternative view. I'm not saying that I would agree, namely that the physical events in the brain are the mental experience, and there is nothing else to explain. That is, you have to. This is explaining away actually the problem of consciousness.
Yes.
So you should consider probably.
That would not only be explained away, that would be my ideal solution. And in fact, people in the 50s, like Smart, like Armstrong, and many neuroscientists, they suggested something that was called more or less the identity theory of consciousness. And they suggested some form of mind-brain identity.
Yeah.
Those theories would have worked if they had been able to show that the properties of the activity inside the brain were alike the properties of our experience. But they failed. They failed to show that the properties of the neural activity in the brain is alike the properties of our own everyday experience of the world. But I think that they went in the right direction. And actually today, the key hypothesis, I will make three key hypotheses here. The first key hypothesis is to suggest something very similar to what Giorgio presented now. So I'm suggesting to consider something physical, which is just like our experience. So which is just what people had been looking for inside of the brain. Something that has just the right properties of the object we are holding in our hand. Only it is not inside the brain. What is this physical thing that has the properties of our experience? And as strange as it might seem, is the object itself. The object is red, round and shiny. And that's the crazy idea that Tim was objecting to. The object that I hold in my hand right now has exactly the same properties of my experience of the apple. Only it happens to be outside of my body. And because it is outside of my body, so far, scientists have not taken it into consideration because they have assumed that whatever my experience is has to be inside my body. But why does it have to be so? What if my experience were physically identical, and so in a way, the form of of such an explanation is just the form of the explanation of people in the 50s, of the mind-brain identity theorists. What if my experience were one and the same with the external objects? After all, neuroscientists have suggested that my experience was one and the same with another object. That's why I always take two objects with me, the brain and the apple, just to make it as physical as possible, that they're both physical things. So there's nothing magical in assuming that my experience might be one and the same with the brain. So why should it be taken as a crazy and bizarre idea, as Tim was complaining, that my experience might be one and the same with this object? I mean, they're both objects, they're both here, but which one of them looks more like my experience of the apple? The brain or the apple itself? And I would say that the apple is just right. There's nothing more applish than the apple. So why could the apple not be one and the same with my experience of the apple? So, right, and then
wait a minute, one thing though, the apple is a lot more than your apple. I'm not going to say your experience, the apple is more than because we know from other experiences of apples that, you know, you're not experiencing the inside of that apple, you're not experiencing the taste of that apple right now. Okay, so the apple's lots of other things. So if you say, I am the apple, you know, that's not right. You're a red thing that's round, but not all the other things that make an apple.
Okay, so for a moment, I do agree. The apple is more, and at the same time is less than my experience. Is more because, for example, there's the inside of the apple, which is not part of my experience. For example, you can eat your apple. I could not eat this apple because this is made of plastic. This is a fake apple. But as long as my experience of the apple goes, they're both the same. I mean, it could be a real apple. As far as your own experience, you know this was a true apple so far. So, in your experience, the inside of this apple is not included. At the same time, is less. What do I mean by the fact that it is less? Because the same apple that I'm holding in my hand right now is different for each of us. Because I see this side of the apple, you see the other side of the apple. I feel it warm, you don't feel it, the temperature of the apple. I see it quite big because it's close to my eyes, and you see it rather small because it's a few meters away from you, and so forth. So this apple is also, I mean, in a way, I have one apple in my hand, but here there are plenty of different apples. So this raises a problem. You may say, Riccardo, that's exactly why people invented the notion of subjective experience. Because there's one apple, and each one is having a different experience of an apple. How do you explain that? And we know that the traditional solution to this problem is to assume that there is a physical apple here, an objective apple here, and then there are as many subjective apples as people in the room. And their subjective apples clearly are different from the apple. See, Riccardo, it's obvious. It's obvious. Yes, but let me ask you a question. Let me shift to another example from physics. Something that we know all very well. Something super simple. Velocity. You have a car. The car is moving here right now or let me get back to the apple itself. Let me ask you from the apple. Is this apple right now still or moving?
Well, it depends in relation to what.
Exactly. So there's no such thing as absolute velocity. So if you were not still, if you were walking in this room, this apple would have a different relative velocity for each of your body. And right now this apple is moving relative to the moon. So right now this apple is both moving and still. Right now this apple, as strange as it seems, as it may seem, is moving in all directions. Only...
Well, but as a physical object
as
or
a
as
physical
perception?
object.
Because in terms of perception, my experience is that the apple is still,
Right.
not moving.
Right, but as a physical object, it's moving in all directions.
Mm-hmm.
because it is moving relative to the umpteen reference frames of the umpteen objects all around these apples, and we can perceive only the velocity it has relative to our body. So the apple looks still to you because your body relative to this apple is still. But of course, relative to, say, the moon, this apple right now is moving at thousands of kilometers per hour.
So it does exist, a physical object irrespective of the experience.
I'm absolutely for a physical object. Only physical objects are intrinsically relative. So my point is that if we take into consideration a simple property such as velocity, this object doesn't have one velocity. It has umpteen velocities. It is moving in all possible directions. Likewise, if we take into consideration each of the property of the apple, for example color, I might argue that this apple has different colors relative to different visual systems. So if one was colorblind, one would react in a different way to the combination of light spectrum, which are reflected by the apple. And so the relative property that would take place thanks to that person's visual system would be different from the property that is taking place thanks to my visual brain. So the point is, if we take into consideration that the physical world is more like relative velocity than like, say, absolute velocity, then we have objects with many more properties than we have usually assumed. The reason why we have assumed that here there's an apple with only one color, only one size, only one velocity, was that we assumed that the object had an absolute existence. What I'm trying to say is that this belief into an absolute object is a naive belief. It's like
wait a minute, can I object? You talked about different animals or different creatures seeing the apple with different colours, okay?
Right.
But there must be some fixed property of the apple that then, in relation to those other creatures, allows for different experiences, but it's still a fixed absolute property of it.
Let me ask you another question then. Is there anything like a fixed velocity of object? No.
No.
The reason. So why there should be any other fixed velocity? I mean, when in physics people gave up absolute velocities with Galileo and took into consideration there are only relative velocity, physics didn't crumble down. Because relative velocity is completely determined and it is possible to compute. So, for a moment, we could say...
So you consider the property only existing insofar as it's relative to something else?
Exactly. The property we experience exists only insofar as they're relative to another body. And that would allow to reconsider the physical properties we experience. Not as something which is there, but as something which takes place whenever our body gives them a possibility to take place. Just like velocity. If we had a particle in the universe, that particle would have no velocity unless another particle would come into the picture and would move relative to the first particle. Likewise, all of the properties that surround us in this moment take place in a certain way because there is our body, which is a certain biological body with certain features, that allows such properties to take place in a certain way. So if there was an animal here, the animal would bring into existence a completely different set of properties. What I'm striving to suggest, what I'm striving to claim is that these properties are not subjective properties. They are relative properties. So, and this is very important, because if we assume that the external world is made only of absolute properties, then we need to invent subjective properties inside organisms. But if we consider an alternative possibility, namely that the world is a whirlwind of relative properties, just like velocity, then each organism can select a cloud of relative properties which are relative to that organism, but that are outside that organism. They don't need to be instantiated inside the organism as subjective properties. They might be in the external world, just like relative velocity. We don't need to say when we go to the highway, we don't need to say that the other cars are moving at a subjective velocity relative to our own car. They have their relative velocity. Their relative velocity is theirs, but that relative velocity is taking place because our car is moving on the highway at a certain speed. So my point is that we were misled by a wrong assumption. The wrong assumption was that the apple that you hold in your hand is the same, while what I'm suggesting you is the apple that you're holding in your hand is a relative apple, like everything else, like relative velocity. And because each of you has a different body, that apple may take place differently for each of you.
So what it comes down to in the end is that your perception is the world. Your so-called experience simply is the world.
Exactly.
That's what.
And to project the diversity of our individual experience in the external world itself. So rather than assuming that there's one external world and then there are many subjective inner worlds that we are not able to find anywhere inside the brain, I am suggesting that there is indeed one external, let me put it differently, that there are indeed many external worlds, each relative to one of our body. So the diversity of our experiences might be the outcome of the existence of multiple relative worlds, external to our body. I'm sorry to repeat myself, but I want to make clear this point. So it's turning upside down the traditional picture. The traditional picture, we assume there's one external world with a fixed list of properties. Then, because our experiences are different, we assume that each of us has an inner mental world different from each other. I am suggesting, no, there's no need to make that step. Rather, there are many, multiple relative worlds, and they are different because they exist relative to each of our bodies.
I don't see why you have to say multiple relative worlds. Why don't you say there's just one world out there with endless possibilities, and every time a body comes into relation to it, we have experience.
Yes.
But why do you have to say the world is multiple, as if it was...
From the perspective of each people's experience, my world is different from your world.
Yeah,
and if, it's a little bit like von Uexküll's notion of Umwelt. So each animal is living in his own world. So I'm just radicalizing the notion of, in a way, von Uexküll's Umwelt notion. I'm taking that very seriously. And by doing that, I think it is possible to reduce subjective experience to relative existence. So, let me get back to the original question by Tim. When we say, I see an apple, what do we mean? There are two options. Traditional option, we mean that somehow the brain has an experience of an apple. But by doing that, we are compelled to look for experience inside the brain, and as I said, so far no one has been able to show me anything like experience in the brain, But there's another option. What does I see an apple mean? It might mean that there's an apple relative to my body, and I am one and the same with the apple.
So wait a minute, so I am not my body, I am the thing that is happening, which is the apple.
Exactly.
Right, okay. So basically you're splitting your body from the thing that is you, and the thing that is you is the world that we say you're experiencing.
Exactly. The body in this picture is the condition for the existence of the relative object, which is one and the same with me. This is an identity theory. So Giorgio mentioned that in the 50s people suggested a mind-brain identity theory. They said we may be identical with the process in the brain. This is an identity theory too. Only the identity in this case is not with the brain. The identity holds with the external object. That's why I call this, the short name for this theory is mind-object identity theory. So rather than being mind-brain identity, I am defending mind-object identity. And in order to make it work, I suggest to revise the notion of the object in terms of relative objects, relative existence. So, you're right, I am not my body in this picture. My body is the last thing that I am. And in some sense, that explains to me very well why nothing in my experience has to do with the physical properties of my, in a way, from a constitutive perspective, of my brain. So I never perceive anything like neural stuff. In my experience, all my experience, the properties I found in my experience are always the properties of the external world, or in certain cases, of my body.
Ricardo, I wonder if it's time for me to show some seriousness.
Yes, please.
Okay. You know, so also to give you a moment to reflect to how to maybe add something. As you can see, I've been exposed to this man who thinks he's an apple for many years. I got to know Ricardo famously at a conference where a guy called Seki, famous professor, as you know, of neuroaesthetics, was talking to us about the representations in the brain when we look at works of art. And Ricardo jumped to his feet and started more or less shouting, "There are no images." Okay, there are no images in the brain that we see, that we can track down. There is just the object out there. And from that followed a very long conversation. What does it all boil down to? It boils down to the idea that Ricardo won't accept our humble human condition of not experiencing the real world, but just experiencing a representational hallucination in our head. He doesn't accept that. He arrogantly believes that his experience actually is the world, and that it's real. And he believes that this solves a lot of problems. One of the interesting things that happened was that in our conversations I got kind of interested in this, and Ricardo started to getting me, said, well, go and read the serious people then. So I did. And I just want to show you, I spent a lot of time, apart from reading, and then going to talk to a number of scientists, philosophers, neuroscientists, and kind of gradually seeing how they would respond to Ricardo's theories of consciousness. I don't know why I'm not getting this on my screen, but it's on the screen up there. And what?
One slide forward will appear.
What?
You want to get the text?
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'll get that in a minute. No, I'm wondering what was on here. What struck me as I started to read the various serious people was how unserious actually a lot of it seems to be. So here we would take a classic, I would say, standard vision of what gets presented to the general public about what consciousness is. Right now you have a movie playing inside your head. This is David Chalmers, the famous hard problem man. It's an amazing movie, well, thank God for that. With 3D smell, taste, touch, a sense of body, pain, hunger, emotions, memories, and a constant overvoiced narrative. I don't know how constant the overvoiced narrative is, but at the heart of this movie is you. Now, notice here how we begin to get a series of complications developing. We have the movie inside the head, then we have you at the heart of the movie, then you have you in the movie experiencing the movie directly. What on earth is the word directly doing there? How else would you experience it? This movie is your stream of consciousness. Now, stream of consciousness is a literary device invented by James Joyce, although he wasn't actually the first person to use it. And the notion of the stream of consciousness is that consciousness is continuous, like streams are. Streams are notoriously continuous until they dry out. However, we know that consciousness is anything but continuous. It's always jumping from one place to another. So let's dumb two. This movie is your stream of consciousness, experience of the mind and the world. So now we've got experience, we've got mind, and we've got world, and we're not quite sure at all what the relationship between these things are. And then at least he's rather more humble than Ricardo. He says the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. And indeed, if you look at the confusion of the uses of I, experience, movie, head, in this, it is indeed extremely mysterious. We're at the level of the Trinity here, I think, for this. I'm not going to look at that now. Let me just move on now. What is happening here? Don't tell me I've got the wrong one. Don't tell me, man. Don't tell me. What have we got here? Okay, why didn't it? Can somebody just help me to the end? This is David Eagleman. David Eagleman has a large neuroscience laboratory in California with a considerable team working for him. He is a great populist of neuroscience. He wrote a book called The Brain, The Story of You, which is already obviously a project. We have a brain, we have a story, and we have a you, which are, it seems, identical to each other, pretty much. And this is David Eagleman then discussing how it all works. Your brain serves up a narrative. And each of us believes whatever narrative it tells. How can we look at this? Your brain produces a narrative. Serves up is rather frightening, as if it was deliberately tricking us. Okay, now this is an interesting thing to notice with Eagleman, but not only Eagleman, I know Seth as well, is this constant presentation of the brain as somehow a subversive, dangerous, tricky mechanism, and the you, or the I, as somebody extremely gullible and nevertheless separate from the brain, so capable of believing something that the brain tells it. Okay. Whether you're falling for a visual illusion, deceived by a visual illusion, or believing the dream you happen to be trapped in, or experiencing objects in color, or accepting the delusion as true during an episode of schizophrenia, we each accept our realities, however our brains script them. It is interesting here, isn't it, how experiencing an object in color becomes the same as having an episode of schizophrenia, which would seem to be a quite different range of experience. However, let's move on here. I hope this is going to start working now. Despite the feeling that we're directly experiencing the world out there, now that directly was what Chalmers told us we were experiencing. However, despite the feeling that we're directly experiencing the world out there, our reality is ultimately built in the dark, in a foreign language of electrochemical signals. Now, as Ricardo said, we have no experience of these electrochemical signals. They build a world in the dark. How they do that, we don't know. We have the experience that we're directly experiencing. All of your sensory experiences are taking place in storms of activity within the computational material of your brain. Notice the love of drama when presenting neuroscience. Storms of activity, you know. You look at an apple and it's...
Yeah, if I just make another point. I mean, notice how they sneak in, they smuggled in a word like computational. Because all of a sudden it's no longer chemical, electrochemical activity, it's computational. It looks better, but it's more abstract. So we are getting one step closer to the mind, but only in the way in which we describe what's going on. Because it's just a model to say that the brain is a computational device. As far as I know, we describe the brain as a computational device. The brain does what it does, namely it does electrochemical activity.
Okay, yeah, we could obviously spend many happy hours looking at, you know, the use of computer terminology to discuss. I spent some time in a neuroscience lab in Heidelberg with a woman called Manya, who does experiments, extremely large laboratory, 20, 30 people, millions of euros, and she's a very, very intelligent, very fine, wonderful person, and wonderfully brilliant. The results, like the ability to identify what neurons are actually doing inside mice is extraordinary. But there's this constant talking in terms of, you know, this neuron is now processing this information and telling this mouse where it is. Now, obviously, you could say in all this that this is simply a way we have of talking about it to make it possible to talk about. But the way we talk about it inevitably determines the direction of the research, it would seem to me. What if I told you that the world around you, with its rich colours, textures, sounds and scents, is an illusion, a show put on for you by your brain? Well, isn't it wonderful here that David Eagleman knows this? Presumably he has a brain. So presumably he is also subject to all these illusions. Okay. But he is able to tell us that he knows an absolute world that we don't know. How does he know it? Presumably because he has machines which, when put in relation to the world, don't show colors but show, I don't know, wavelengths or something like that. And we are asked to believe that the reality is the relation of the machine to the world, not the relation of the body to the world. It's difficult to understand why the relation of the machine to the world should necessarily produce a superior result there. If you could perceive reality as it really is, you would be shocked. And in fact, Eagleman has said in various interviews that he is personally shocked to know that the world is colourless. And he begins to wonder if there isn't something in the world that might be like a soul, because he doesn't feel that the world is really like this. So poor Eagleman gets trapped inside this vision. You'll be shocked by its colourless, odourless, tasteless silence. Now this reminded, I remember I quoted this when I got to talk to Manya in the end, because it reminded me of something I did in a Latin lesson at school, or maybe even a Greek lesson. Intellect to the senses. Ostensibly there is colour, ostensibly sweetness, ostensibly bitterness, actually only atoms and the void. Senses to intellect. Poor intellect, do you hope to defeat us while from us you borrow your evidence? Your victory is your defeat. That is, without the senses, you could never have arrived at the first formulation in the first place. And who said this? Democritus in the 4th century before Christ. Okay. So the debate's been going on quite a while. Let's do just a bit more of Eagleman and then maybe one more slightly sort of serious thing. Outside your brain there is just energy and matter. Just notice the just there. Energy and matter is quite a big operation, energy and matter. What else did you expect there would be? A spirit? sealed within the dark, here we go again, silent chamber of your skull, your brain has never directly experienced the external world, and it never will. What is this direct experience? Notice here that the idea he's taken the idea that there is experience, and then there is maybe vicarious experience in films, and then he has passed this on to the idea of all perception, that all perception is a removed experience.
Let me add something about this. Here there is the completely unproved belief that we are one and the same with the brain. So your brain has never directly experienced the external world. There's a hidden assumption there, namely that the thing that we are in the world has to be the brain. That's where we are.
Honestly, Ricardo, I don't agree. I think it's more muddled than that. I think it's more confused, because he says your brain, as if you was more than your brain, so a brain is a part of you. Then he says it never will, so your brain will never experience the world. I think the idea is your brain is what's telling you the story of what the world is like. It has no direct experience of the world, so you can't have any either. So it's hugely complicated.
Okay, I do agree with that. But even if it is more muddled, the point is that it assumes that the brain is the point from which we access the world.
Absolutely.
The brain is seen as the gate from which somehow we access to the world. This is very Cartesian, because in the car there was the pineal gland, and from the pineal gland we kind of access the world. But why do we have to enter into the world from the brain? Why our access to the world is not from the brain, but is from the object?
Let's move on a little bit. I just want to show you now how obsessive it is. We'll go through this quickly. Who you are at any given moment depends on the detailed rhythms of your neural firing. So it depends only on that, as it were. It doesn't also depend on who you're having a conversation with, or whether the apple is bitter or sweet. Who you are depends on what your neurons are up to. Your interpretation of physical objects has everything to do with the historical trajectory of your brain and little to do with the objects themselves. Well, that seems extraordinary. Little to do with the objects themselves. I think everybody in the room agreed that the apples were apples. So presumably it had something to do with the objects themselves. Your perception of reality has less to do with what's happening out there and more to do with what's happening, etc. We don't know. Every marriage proposal, every declaration of war, every leap of the imagination, every mission launched into the unknown, every act of kindness, every lie, every euphoric breakthrough, every decisive moment, it all happened right there in the darkness. Endless repetition of this use of darkness. Darkness. Why does it not go back, man? Shit. Never mind. We've got, I think we've pretty much got, I want to take that off the screen. I don't want that up on the screen. I don't seem to be very happy with this. It always happens when I can't do it. Let me just say before, don't read that now. I just want to say one thing more about Eagleman. Eagleman has a very special job as well as his neuroscientist job. He heads a department called the Center for Science and Law, which is an institute that advises judges on the level of responsibility of people who have committed criminal acts. Okay, so this man is with all his very sophisticated and no doubt brilliant work, is in a position where he is invited to comment on levels of responsibility. Now, obviously, as we've already seen from what he says, the brain scripts your world for you. So in a certain sense, the whole notion of responsibility is eliminated before we even begin to talk about it. It's simply extraordinary to me that somebody who holds a position like that, which is not an uncommon position now. I'm just going to finish with this, because you might think this is super more serious. This is from Nature, and this is Koch and Tononi, and they are summing up the findings of the last 10 years in their work and in neuroscience. So this should be like the super serious thing. No single brain area seems to be necessary for being conscious, but a few areas, especially in the posterior cortical hot zone, are good candidates for both full and content-specific neural correlates of consciousness. So the state of play is that, okay? They are good candidates for full, which I presume means general, and then content-specific, obviously the specific perceptions, neural correlates, not the thing itself, but a correlate of the thing itself. The sheer number of causal interactions in the brain, together with the fleeting nature of many experiences, pose challenges to even sophisticated experimental approaches to the NCC. Isn't that an extraordinary sentence, the way it's set up? Like, how could they have ever imagined that it wouldn't pose challenges? Like, as if it was a surprise to find that the fleeting nature of experiences pose challenges to even sophisticated equipment. I would imagine that nothing could be more obvious than how fluctuating and complex life is. However, that's not what I really want to talk about. The correlates of consciousness by themselves can provide little information about consciousness. In patients with severe brain damage, infants, fetuses, non-human species, or intelligent machines. Little information about consciousness. What information about consciousness does it provide in healthy, ordinary people is not made clear. Then he says, and this is the sentence I really want to look at. So this is Tononi and Koch talking about the future. Further process in this field will require, in addition to empirical work, testable theories. Testable theories that address in a principled manner what consciousness is and what is required of its physical substrate. So, first they say they don't have any theories, testable theories, or at least they're not going to present them there. And then they say what consciousness is and what is required of its physical substrate, at which point it seems that consciousness is not physical. Okay, it has a physical substrate, and we're right back in having a theory of consciousness that is in fact dualistic. Okay, but the thing, I'm not an expert on, obviously, neither from a neuroscientific point of view, neither from a philosophical point of view. But as somebody who spent his life writing essays, what astonishes me about the work of almost all these people is the extraordinary laziness in establishing the terms that they're actually talking about. It seems that they have a model and that they continue regardless. And it was indeed after reading all this stuff that I began to take Ricardo a little bit more seriously, because it becomes clear that as a description of experience, the description that Ricardo's offering seems closer to the nature of experience that I had. And what I tried to do in this book I wrote was, with immense meticulousness and fun, but also a certain discipline, to really try and enjoy savoring experience and trying to describe it in a way that didn't introduce all these crazy elements of movies in the head and so on and so forth. Ricardo, I pass over to you.
No. Well, so I think that all of this shows that once we move from the assumption that we are separate from the external world, like all these people do, not because they are dumb, but because that's the traditional assumption, things get very muddled, things get very mysterious, and we got in all kind of complication. If I have an experience of the world, what is the experience made of? And how can it emerge out of the neural activity? And nobody has a clue, basically, how that can be possible. And if we didn't have experience of the world, we wouldn't guess there's anything like conscious experience by watching the neural activity in our brain. So we didn't have first-person access to our experience just by working in a neuroscience department. Nobody would ever come up with the idea that the neural activity is somehow related with conscious experience, and that should tell us something, namely that the consciousness maybe is not where we've been looking for. So I told you that I wanted to make 3 key hypotheses here. I made 2, and I would like to draw to the conclusion with the last one. So the first hypothesis was, let's look elsewhere. Let's look not in the brain, but let's look in the external world. The second hypothesis was let's revise the external world. So the external world is made of relative objects. And of course, I think that many of you are thinking, yes, but there's a big objection. And the big objection is, in many cases, it seems that the brain is sufficient to have experience of the external world, such as dreams, hallucination, illusions, and the like. That's why all these people keep talking about hallucination. That's why they say the world is colorless. So they basically say to us that colors are an illusion or a hallucination. And that's why all these people speak like Plato in the cave, or like Galileo in the Essayer. And so, as I've done with the relative object, I'm asking you to reconsider the external world. And I won't make any fancy hypothesis about the external world. I'm just asking you to take seriously fundamental physics. So, just to make this point clearer, I have this, I call it the spatio-temporal chessboard, which is just what I think is the physical world. So, for me, the physical world is everything that takes place in space and time. So, I just compress all the spatial dimension in one, and we have just time. So, everything is just here. For me, everything, you can imagine, of course, this board to be infinite. But just to make it simpler, I made just a chessboard. So everything just has to be here. Everything which is physical has to be somewhere on this chessboard. Space and time. Now, in this chessboard we have the external object and the body, or brain. And of course, I mean, they are in different position in space and time. This is obvious. The external object has to be in a different location in space, and of course it is also in a different location in time. Why? Because everything takes time in nature. Maybe not a lot of time, maybe only a few hundred milliseconds, but all of you know that in my visual experience the world is always a few hundred milliseconds in delay. Sometimes less, sometimes 10 milliseconds, but still it is a lot of time. If you were a computer, that would be a lot of time. So a lot of time, a lot of things can happen in the time from where the object is producing an effect on my body and the moment in which I have an experience of the body. Now, why I ask you to consider that very seriously? Because this suggests us a picture in which there's always a space-time separation between the object and the body. But this doesn't mean that we don't perceive the apple, which is here. So I'm asking you to stretch a little bit your imagination and to consider that the apple is getting farther and farther away. Like, for example, it happened with the moon. The moon is just an apple which is much, much farther away and much bigger, but it's just like the apple. It's an object, it's spherical, and it does just what the apple does. The moon is 1.5 seconds far away from our body. Still there. When we look at the moon, do we see the moon or do we see an image of the moon? Of course we see the moon, just like when we see the apple. And what about the sun? The sun is an even bigger apple, and it is even farther and farther away. It's 8 minutes away, 150 million kilometers away. But we still perceive the sun. We don't perceive an image of the sun. Yes, I know sometimes people at school, they taught us that we don't see the sun because the sun might have been exploded. We don't really see the sun. But then we don't really see the apple either. Because, I mean, a very fast explosion might get rid of the apple in the time I need to perceive the apple. And hope not. But that might happen. So there's no physical difference between looking at the sun and looking at an apple. Or looking at the star, which is 58 light years. And although we are taught at school that we don't really see stars. But what do we see? Lights? Then we don't see the apple either. And even the answer about light doesn't work. Because if we consider that seriously, then we would have the neural activity in the optical nerve. So there's always some in between. So, having said that, what I'm asking you is to revise your notion of the present. So, rather than think that we perceive just the things that happen at the moment in the same column in which the neural activity takes place, I'm asking you to consider that we might be elsewhere. So that experience might be physically located wherever and whenever, at the time and at the place where the external object existed.
Can I just interrupt? What about a constellation where the stars have never actually been in the relation which we see them in because of the different time distances? So what's going on there?
Actually, the constellation, those stars shown many years ago in their place, but as a constellation, as a whole, they had to wait until there was a body in the right position in space-time on a planet in the right position in the solar system, and those light rays could finally get to an end altogether. They started as separate stars, and they had to wait to exist as a constellation relative to a body. They had to wait to meet a body in a certain point in space-time.
So like a rainbow or something like that.
The rainbow, yesterday we were talking about the rainbow, is one of my favorite examples, because it's an object that physically exists only relative to a particular body in a particular position. In fact, two people cannot share the same rainbow. If you're watching at a cloud, you may think that you're seeing the same rainbow, but because your bodies are in two different positions in space-time, you are surely perceiving two physically different, slightly different rainbows, as you can check by moving. So why is this notion about space and time important? Because it might provide a different explanation of memory, dreams, and hallucination in terms of perception of actual particulars that had been in relation, physical relation with our body in the past. And that might explain why hallucinations are always made of elementary properties of physical objects that we met in the past. So as far as we know, we don't hallucinate colors that don't belong to the spectrum that we perceive. We don't hallucinate anything unusual. Descartes himself, the champion of dualism, observed that when we dream, we're like a painter that tries to create fictionary animals and has to put together an eagle, a horse, a man, a fish, and gets a siren or a centaur. So think about that. A system as complex as the brain, with so many millions of connections, if it was really the system that was self-sufficient in producing mental properties, should it not produce completely alien, completely bizarre elementary properties sooner or later? I'm not saying that it should happen all the time. I'm just saying sooner or later it should happen. Like it happened with DNA, for example, that sometimes it produces a completely unexpected mutation. Why don't we have anything like that in our hallucination and dreams? If you go through all the literature about, for example, electrical stimulation of the brain, for example, take Penfield. Penfield filled books and books with reports from the patient, but more recent neuroscientists, of course, have done the same with transmagnetic stimulation and other kind of electrical stimulation of the cortex. And look at the report of the hallucinations. I saw my mother in my room. I heard people talking. I see the hall in which I was studying when I was a child. There's an incredible lack of novelty in hallucination. Of course, the recombination, as crazy as you like, of existing particulars, but you never have anything really new, like a new color, like a new geometry, like something like that. So the point is, if we take seriously the notion of space-time, then we can reconsider hallucination, memory, and dreams as a form of perception. And what is perception? Perception might be identity with the physical object, which is just like the explanation that has been suggested by neuroscientists. They suggested that experience was indeed being identical with a physical object. Only they suggested that a physical object like neural activity that doesn't have the property of my experience. What am I doing? Basically, I'm taking exactly the same explanation proposed by the neuroscientists, that they said, let's look for something physical, which is our experience, but I am suggesting this something physical is not inside the body at the time, space-time, at the time where the process gets to an end, but it's the physical external cause or object at the beginning of the physical process. We are not at the end. We are at the beginning of the physical process. And that doesn't require anything new. Everything is still physical. I'm a strong physicalist. But we might be here rather than there. We might be where the object takes place. And we might be one and the same with the physical object. That's the core of the idea that I'm trying to defend, and I would be happy to resist to any possible objection to this.
I think it's time for you to take questions.
Yes.
I'm not going to take questions.